perfectly okay. So, living in the part of Germany that until 1989 was a socialist country, and as such mostly disconnected from any particular religious tradition, I often find myself involved in conversations with people, both young and old, who have no religious background. When I grew up in West Germany, it was fashionable to self-identify as atheist, so that was sort of my time. But of course, atheists typically have an understanding of what they are against. Now, this is very different today because people are not usually opposed to religion in principle, at least not in my part of the world, but they simply do not see a reason to add religion to their lives. One can have a good life, be a responsible husband, wife, father, mother, be a faithful citizen of one's communities. There's no opening in people's lives, as it were, no need or desire for what organized religion is or what it might have to offer. The phenomenon of modern secularism has often been described and assessed as either a sign of progressive emancipation or as a symptom of decay in Western-style societies. The situation of largely secularized societies yields some revealing insights into the nature of religions such as Judaism and Christianity. First of all, religions are extremely complex entities consisting of virtually impenetrable networks of beliefs and practices that have grown over time. This means that being religious or having a religion is a matter of long-term exposure to and socialization in a particular religion. It requires an intellectual and, as we just heard, emotional and experiential disposition that one typically develops over a lifetime rather than by a focused, intentional effort. Secularism, in my reading, marks an interruption of these long-term processes, which is, of course, exactly what defendants of secularism, such as Jürgen Habermas or others, see as a healthy development. Religions cannot claim truth and acceptance simply by referring to their own tradition. They're just as much subject to public scrutiny and challenge as every other worldview. This puts religion in a dilemma situation. On the one hand, it is something that requires immersion in a tradition. On the other hand, it operates in a world that believes in rational choices and in the possibility of a good life that does not depend on any specific religious commitment. To be sure, a secularized world is not per se a hostile environment for religion, although it is certainly not religion's natural environment either. However, this is only one side of the problem. Not only is it difficult for people without prior exposure to gain access to the complexities of religion, it seems equally difficult for religious people to achieve critical distance to their beliefs and practices. As paradoxical as it may sound, one can be religious without knowing what that actually is, by simply functioning in ways that are consistent with the views and expectations of a given community. Such a lack of critical distance, reflection, and accountability is, of course, the danger that lurks behind religious fundamentalism in its many contemporary variations. By that I don't necessarily mean militant Islamism or the like, but a more basic tendency of religious people to take their religion for granted. The danger of secularism for religious people seems to be that because others do not care, they do not feel obligated to account for what they believe. This may be part of the problem in the United States, where there seems to be a deadlock between religious conservatives and liberals these days. Now, finding new language. Given that we live in a world in which secularism and religious fundamentalism occur side by side, not just in the Middle East, but also in the US or Central Europe, obviously this is not something that we can solve this week, but what does it mean? But what does it mean for the work that we do and how we articulate ourselves both in religious environments and in the public arena? So, I think it's interesting that I don't think that has ever occurred before, that you have two such opposing approaches, fundamentalism and secularism, really within the same cultural habitat. Now, an important task in this regard, it seems to me, is finding basic or basal language and images. The sociologist Niklas Luhmann calls it the most important task for modern societies and their social systems to reduce complexity. This does not mean to simplify things or even dumb them down, but to render them somewhat more manageable and accessible. Now, it may be in order to talk very briefly about a project that Rav Shabtai and myself have been thinking about for quite some time. We've looked at the concept of reverse engineering, or what I like even better, back engineering. Reverse engineering is a way of handling complex and mostly technical systems. The case of computer software is particularly instructive because, as we all know, over time it gets increasingly more complex with revisions, add-ons, enhanced speed, and the like. So all the things that I hate about my computer, that it gets more complex and I don't get it. But while every revision may be an improvement of a particular sequence of the software program, there's no guarantee that these revisions remain consistent with the original design and purpose. This is where reverse engineering is used. The task is to find out if a technical unit in its current form can still be traced back to the original blueprint. It is a way of ensuring continuity without precluding the possibility of change and growth. Now, religions too are complex systems that undergo development, mostly as a response to changing cultural and political environments. But precisely because these developments depend on situation and circumstance, the level to which they reconnect with a religion's original design may not always be clear. I think it is safe to say that the emphasis on historical studies that play such an important role right now in Judaism and Christianity is more and should be more than an effort to inventorize the religious past. Historical studies aim at highlighting what is new or at least different against the backdrop of what had already been there. There's a desire to assess the level of continuity and faithfulness in processes of historical development, even if this leads one to the conclusion that religions may not always be in continuity with or faithful to their original ideas. To that extent, one may well describe the intentions of historians of religion or exegetes like me, at least to some extent, in terms of reverse engineering. There's a more or less explicit desire to get back to the blueprint, to the underlying design, or else the study of history would be an encyclopedic matter only. Now, the goal would be to show that processes that can be described as reverse engineering occurred quite early in Judaism and Christianity, namely already in the making and the composition of biblical books. And the working hypothesis that's sort of been our project for a while is that both religions, Judaism and Christianity, from their inception, had a strong tendency towards developing ever-growing and forward-moving traditions, but at the same time to tie this development back to some basic beliefs and ideas that should not be lost or overgrown along the way. Now, to make all this abstract talk a little more specific, I want to turn to one particular biblical text, and that's the book of Genesis, and maybe illustrate some of what I mean by all of this. Now, a particularly instructive case of this backward orientation is the first book of the Hebrew Bible, Bereshit, or Genesis. Readers of Genesis have always noticed that this book is somewhat different from the rest of the Torah. Obviously, we're supposed to read Genesis as the first act of a story or even drama that unfolds over all 5 books of the Torah and even further. Genesis does not have the same religious significance as a foundational story as the book of Exodus and the Sinai pericope, and yet it is the first book of the Hebrew Bible, the front portal through which everyone has to enter the building. So what then is the significance of Genesis if it's not really the foundational story? What I want to do in the following is to delineate a reading of Genesis as a book that provides religious foundations without, however, being fundamentalist. It is a book that, in my understanding, wants to be a reference point in the complexities of religious beliefs and convictions. As such, Genesis offers a basic introduction to some of the essentials of Jewish and Christian religion. I know it's a bold statement, Jewish and Christian religion, but since we're among ourselves, I'll just risk the risky language. So let me focus on three concepts that seem particularly pertinent in this regard. First, the value of life. Second, promise and faith. And finally, God as the open question. So, the value of life. And now it gets more basic.